The year was 1885, and the unforgiving Arizona Territory had been in the grip of its worst drought in living memory for 7 brutal months. 16-year-old Sarah Jane McKenna had been missing in Devil's Canyon for 3 weeks. 3 weeks in, a maze of red rock walls, where temperatures soared past 115 degrees by noon, where flash floods could turn dry arroyos into death traps in minutes, and where even the Apache avoided traveling during the summer months. The search parties had given up after the second week, declaring the labyrinthine canyon system too vast and dangerous to navigate. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Everyone had lost hope. Everyone except Greyhawk, a half-crow scout who could read stories in wind-blown sand that others couldn't even see. What happened in those 21 days would become a legend of survival that would echo through the territories for generations, a testament to the unbreakable spirit of a girl who refused to surrender to the desert's fury, and the unlikely bond forged between two worlds that rarely understood each other. The McKenna homestead sat like a defiant outpost against the endless expanse of the Sonoran Desert, carved from the harsh Arizona landscape through 3 generations of Irish stubbornness and backbreaking labor. The ranch stretched across 12,000 acres of seemingly barren land that patriarch Seamus McKenna had claimed in 1862, seeing potential where others saw only desolation. Seamus McKenna had arrived in the Arizona Territory as a young man, fleeing the potato famine in County Cork, carrying nothing but a worn Bible, an unshakable faith in hard work, and a letter from his cousin describing opportunities in the American Southwest. What he found was a land that tested every fiber of his being, scorching summers that could kill the unprepared, winters that brought unexpected cold, and a landscape that demanded respect for its hidden dangers and subtle gifts. But Seamus possessed the peculiar Irish gift for thriving in impossible places. He learned to read the desert's moods, to find water where others saw only dust, and to coax life from soil that seemed determined to remain barren. Within 5 years, he had established a cattle operation that supplied beef to the growing mining camps scattered throughout the territory. His son, Patrick McKenna, inherited not only the ranch, but his father's intuitive understanding of desert survival. Patrick expanded the operation, adding horse breeding to their cattle business and establishing the McKenna name as synonymous with quality livestock and fair dealing throughout the territory. He married Bridget O'Sullivan, a schoolteacher from Tucson whose education and fierce intelligence perfectly complemented his practical knowledge of ranching. By 1885, the McKenna Ranch had become one of the most successful operations in the Arizona Territory, supporting not only the immediate family, but also a dozen cowboys, 3 full-time horse trainers, and a rotating crew of seasonal workers who came from as far away as California to work for the McKennas during roundup season. Patrick and Bridget McKenna had 4 children, each as different as the desert flowers that bloomed after rare summer rains. Their eldest son, Michael, at 22, possessed his grandfather's natural leadership and his father's business acumen. He managed the day-to-day operations of the ranch with a maturity that impressed even the most experienced cowboys. James, 20 years old, had inherited his mother's love of learning combined with his grandfather's wanderlust. He spent his time between the ranch and the territorial capital, studying law and politics while maintaining his connection to the family business. Everyone expected James to eventually run for territorial legislature, maybe even statehood governor. When Arizona finally achieved that goal, their daughter Mary Catherine, 18, embodied her mother's refinement and intelligence while possessing a surprising talent for horse training that had earned respect throughout the territory. She could gentle the wildest Mustang with patience and intuition that seemed almost supernatural, and her trained horses commanded premium prices from buyers as far away as San Francisco. And then there was Sarah Jane McKenna, the youngest at 16, who possessed all of her family's best qualities, amplified by a restless spirit that refused to be contained by conventional expectations. Sarah Jane McKenna was a force of nature wrapped in the deceptively delicate frame of a 16-year-old girl. With her father's piercing blue eyes and her mother's auburn hair that caught desert sunlight like burnished copper, she possessed a beauty that turned heads in Prescott and Phoenix when the family made their infrequent trips to town. But Sarah Jane's true distinguishing characteristic wasn't her appearance. It was her insatiable curiosity about the natural world that surrounded their ranch. While other ranchers' daughters learned embroidery and piano, Sarah Jane studied the migration patterns of desert bighorn sheep, documented the flowering cycles of desert plants, and mapped water sources throughout the vast territory surrounding their homestead. Her bedroom walls were covered with hand-drawn maps of canyons, mesas, and hidden valleys that she had explored during her solo expeditions. Each map was annotated with detailed observations, which arroyos carried water during different seasons, where indigenous plants provided food or medicine, which rock formations offered shelter from summer heat or winter storms. Sarah Jane's knowledge of the desert rivaled that of men who had spent their entire lives in the territory. She could predict weather changes by observing cloud formations and wind patterns, find water by reading the flight paths of birds and the growth patterns of certain plants, and navigate through terrain that had no established trails or landmarks. Her parents had initially tried to discourage what they considered unladylike behavior, but Bridget McKenna was too intelligent not to recognize her daughter's exceptional gifts. Sarah Jane possessed an almost supernatural ability to read the desert's subtle signs. The way morning shadows fell across rock formations indicated direction when no compass was available. The behavior of desert animals revealed the location of hidden water sources, and the color variations in sand and stone told stories about underground geology that could mean the difference between life and death. Patrick McKenna had given up trying to keep his youngest daughter close to the ranch buildings. Instead, he had taught her survival skills that went far beyond what most frontier families considered necessary for their children. Sarah Jane could start a fire without matches using desert plants and flint, construct shelter from available materials, identify edible and medicinal plants, and most importantly, navigate by reading natural signs that remained constant regardless of weather or season. By her 16th birthday, Sarah Jane had explored more of the Arizona territory than most grown men. She had mapped hidden valleys where Apache families had once lived, discovered natural springs that didn't appear on any territorial survey, and documented plant and animal species that territorial scientists had never catalogued. Her exploration partner was a paint mare named Sage, a horse she had gentled herself from a wild Mustang captured during a roundup 3 years earlier. Sage possessed the sure-footedness and desert instincts that made her an ideal companion for Sarah Jane's expeditions. The two had developed an almost telepathic communication, with Sage often sensing dangers or opportunities that Sarah Jane's human senses missed. The summer of 1885 brought unprecedented challenges to the Arizona territory. What had begun as a normal dry season in March had stretched through April, May, and June, without the usual scattered thunderstorms that recharged desert water sources. By July, even the most experienced ranchers were beginning to worry about their long-term water supplies. The McKenna Ranch, with its network of wells and carefully maintained cisterns, was better prepared than most operations for extended drought conditions. But by August, even their reserves were showing strain. Cattle had to be moved constantly to access the few remaining water sources, and the family had begun rationing water for all non-essential uses. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. More troubling than the immediate water shortage was the behavior of wildlife throughout the territory. Desert bighorn sheep, normally seen only in the highest, most remote canyon areas, were appearing near ranch buildings in their desperate search for water. Javelinas, rattlesnakes, and even normally reclusive mountain lions were venturing into areas they typically avoided, creating dangerous encounters with humans and livestock. Sarah Jane documented these changes with scientific precision, understanding that the animal behavior patterns revealed important information about the drought's severity and potential duration. Her observations suggested that the current drought was more severe than any recorded in territorial history, possibly worse than conditions that had existed for decades or even centuries. The territorial government had begun coordinating relief efforts, trucking water to the most severely affected areas, and establishing emergency distribution points in major towns. But isolated ranches like the McKennas were largely on their own, forced to rely on their own preparations and resources. For Sarah Jane, the drought presented both a crisis and an opportunity. Her detailed knowledge of hidden water sources throughout the surrounding territory made her an invaluable resource for the family's survival planning. She had discovered springs and seeps that didn't appear on any official maps, seasonal water sources that might still be flowing when conventional wells ran dry. But the drought also created new dangers that even Sarah Jane's extensive experience hadn't prepared her for. Familiar landmarks were changing as water levels dropped, exposing rock formations and geological features that had been hidden for years. Navigation routes that had been reliable for generations were becoming hazardous as sand patterns shifted and traditional reference points disappeared. In early September, as the drought entered its 7th month with no relief in sight, Patrick McKenna faced a crisis that threatened the ranch's long-term survival. Their primary well, which had never failed in 23 years of operation, was showing signs of serious decline. The secondary wells were producing brackish water that cattle could drink, but that posed health risks for extended human consumption. Sarah Jane proposed a solution that initially horrified her parents, but gradually revealed itself as perhaps their only viable option. During her explorations over the past 3 years, she had discovered what appeared to be a significant underground river system in the Devil's Canyon area, approximately 30 miles northeast of their ranch. Devil's Canyon was a place that inspired fear and superstition throughout the territory. The massive canyon system stretched for over 50 miles through some of the most rugged and inaccessible terrain in Arizona. Its red sandstone walls rose hundreds of feet above narrow passages that twisted and branched in patterns that defied logical navigation. Flash floods during rare storms could turn dry washes into torrential rivers that swept away anything in their path. More ominously, Devil's Canyon was associated with numerous disappearances over the years. Prospectors, hunters, and even experienced scouts had entered the canyon system and never emerged. Apache bands avoided the area entirely, referring to it in their language as the place where spirits become lost. But Sarah Jane's careful observations had convinced her that a substantial underground water system existed within the canyon complex. She had noted the behavior of birds that flew directly into the canyon each morning and evening, following flight patterns that suggested they were traveling to reliable water sources. Plant growth in certain areas indicated subsurface moisture that could only come from significant underground flows. Most convincingly, Sarah Jane had discovered geological formations along the canyon's outer edges that clearly showed ancient water flow patterns. Her amateur but careful study of rock layers and mineral deposits suggested that underground rivers had carved passages through the canyon system for thousands of years, creating hidden reservoirs that might still contain substantial water supplies. The plan Sarah Jane proposed was ambitious, and dangerous. She would undertake a systematic exploration of Devil's Canyon's interior, mapping water sources and establishing supply routes that could sustain the ranch through the drought's duration. The expedition would require at least 2 weeks of careful exploration, moving methodically through the canyon system while establishing supply caches and escape routes. Patrick McKenna's initial reaction was absolute refusal. The risks were enormous, and the potential for tragedy was too great to contemplate. But as September progressed and their water situation became increasingly desperate, the family began to seriously consider Sarah Jane's proposal. Bridget McKenna, despite her natural concern for her daughter's safety, recognized that Sarah Jane possessed unique qualifications for such an expedition. Her knowledge of desert survival was exceptional. Her navigation skills were proven, and her systematic approach to exploration minimized many of the risks that made Devil's Canyon so dangerous for other travelers. More pragmatically, no one else, in the family or among their employees, possessed the combination of skills necessary for such an undertaking. The cowboys were experienced with cattle and horses, but had limited knowledge of technical navigation or water location. Michael and James were capable men, but lacked Sarah Jane's specific expertise in desert survival and geological observation. The decision to approve Sarah Jane's expedition came in late September after a family conference that lasted 3 days and involved every adult member of the McKenna household. The plan that emerged was carefully structured to maximize safety while accomplishing the critical goal of locating reliable water sources. Sarah Jane would travel with Sage and a pack, carrying supplies for 3 weeks of independent operation. Her equipment included the most advanced navigation instruments the family could obtain: a surveyor's compass, detailed topographical maps of the known canyon approaches, a barometer for weather prediction, and a specially constructed measuring chain for mapping distances and elevations. Her survival equipment reflected both frontier practicality and scientific precision. A canvas shelter designed specifically for desert conditions, cooking equipment suitable for minimal impact camping, water purification materials, including cloth filters and chemical tablets, and medical supplies for treating injuries, dehydration, and heat exhaustion. Most importantly, Sarah Jane carried emergency signaling equipment that would allow her to communicate with search parties if necessary. She had 3 different types of signal mirrors, emergency flares that could be seen for miles in the clear desert air, and a supply of materials for creating large ground signals visible from elevated positions. The expedition timeline called for Sarah Jane to spend 2 days reaching Devil's Canyon's main entrance, 10 days systematically exploring the interior water sources, 2 days establishing supply caches and marking routes, and 3 days returning to the ranch with detailed maps and reports. Emergency protocols required Sarah Jane to return to predetermined checkpoints every 3 days, where she would leave coded messages indicating her status and planned movements. If she failed to appear at any checkpoint, search parties would be dispatched immediately with instructions to follow her marked route into the canyon system. Patrick McKenna recruited additional help for the potential search operations, including 2 experienced trackers from neighboring ranches and a former Army scout who had worked in the territory for over 15 years. These men would remain on standby throughout Sarah Jane's expedition, ready to mount rescue operations at the first sign of trouble. The night before her departure, Sarah Jane spent hours reviewing her maps and equipment with obsessive attention to detail. Every item had been carefully selected and tested, every contingency planned for as thoroughly as possible. She understood that her life would depend on the quality of her preparations and the accuracy of her decision-making once she entered Devil's Canyon's treacherous interior. October 3rd, 1885 dawned clear and still, with the kind of crystalline air that made distant mountains appear close enough to touch. Sarah Jane woke before sunrise as was her habit, and completed her final equipment checks by lantern light while her family slept. Sage stood patiently in the corral as Sarah Jane secured the last of her supplies, the mare's intelligent eyes, reflecting an understanding that this journey would be different from their usual day-long expeditions. The pack mule, a steady gelding named Jasper, carried enough water for 5 days and food supplies that would last 3 weeks if carefully rationed. As dawn light began to illuminate the eastern mountains, the McKenna family gathered in the ranch yard for what they all hoped would not be their final goodbye. The emotional weight of the moment was almost overwhelming. They were sending their youngest daughter alone into one of the most dangerous places in the Arizona Territory, with only her skills and preparation standing between her and a dozen different ways to die. Bridget McKenna held her daughter close, whispering prayers and last-minute advice that Sarah Jane accepted with patient grace. Patrick McKenna checked her equipment one final time, his practical nature asserting itself even as his heart broke with worry. Michael and James offered encouragement, mixed with stern warnings about taking unnecessary risks. Mary Catherine presented Sarah Jane with a surprise gift, a small silver compass that had belonged to their grandfather Seamus, engraved with Celtic symbols and carried across the Atlantic during his immigration to America. "For finding your way home," Mary Catherine said simply, her voice tight with emotion. As the sun crested the eastern ridges, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber, Sarah Jane mounted Sage and took Jasper's lead rope. She looked back, once at her family, memorizing their faces and the familiar buildings that had sheltered her for 16 years. Then she turned toward the northeast, toward Devil's Canyon, and whatever awaited her in its hidden depths. The first miles passed through familiar territory that Sarah Jane had explored countless times during her childhood expeditions. The landscape gradually changed from the relatively gentle terrain around the ranch to the more rugged foothills that marked the approach to the canyon country. By mid-morning, she had left all signs of human habitation behind and entered the vast, empty landscape that had challenged and claimed so many travelers over the years. As she rode deeper into the wilderness, Sarah Jane felt the familiar excitement that always accompanied her explorations, mixed with a sobering awareness of the stakes involved in this particular journey. Behind her lay family, home, and safety. Ahead lay the unknown depths of Devil's Canyon, where her survival skills would be tested as never before, and where the difference between success and disaster might depend on decisions she hadn't yet imagined she would need to make. The adventure that would become legend was beginning, carrying a 16-year-old Irish girl toward a destiny that would test every lesson she had learned about survival, courage, and the unbreakable bonds that connect all living things to the harsh and beautiful land that shapes their lives. By noon on her first day, Sarah Jane reached the outer edge of Devil's Canyon, where the familiar rolling desert gave way to something far more ominous. The canyon didn't announce itself with dramatic cliffs or obvious geological markers. Instead, it began as a subtle depression in the landscape, a seemingly innocent wash that gradually deepened as it wound eastward into the heart of the territory's most forbidding wilderness. Sarah Jane dismounted at what local maps designated as Widow's Point, the last reliable landmark before entering the canyon proper. From this elevated position, she could see the serpentine path that would carry her into Devil's Canyon's depths, but the view was deceiving. What appeared from above to be a straightforward route through red sandstone walls was actually the beginning of a three-dimensional maze that had confounded and claimed travelers for generations. The silence was the first thing that struck her as unnatural. Desert landscapes were never truly quiet. There was always the whisper of wind through stone, the distant cry of hawks, the rustle of small creatures moving through brush. But here, At the threshold of Devil's Canyon, an oppressive stillness seemed to absorb sound before it could travel more than a few yards. Even Sage seemed affected by the atmosphere, her ears swiveling constantly as she searched for familiar sounds that simply weren't present. Sarah Jane spent an hour at Widow's Point, carefully studying the terrain ahead and making detailed notes in her expedition journal. The geological formations visible from her vantage point told a story of violent water action over countless centuries. Smooth carved channels in the rock face indicated flash floods of tremendous power, while mineral staining on the canyon walls revealed water levels that rose and fell dramatically with seasonal variations. Most significantly, Sarah Jane observed bird behavior that confirmed her theories about hidden water sources. Ravens and smaller desert birds followed consistent flight paths that led directly into the canyon's interior, disappearing around bends in the rock walls with the purposeful movement of creatures traveling to known destinations. These weren't random exploration flights. They were regular commutes to reliable resources. As she prepared to descend into the canyon, Sarah Jane performed her final equipment check with ritualistic thoroughness. Every item was secured against loss or damage, every backup system tested and confirmed operational. She redistributed weight between Sage's saddle and Jasper's pack to optimize balance for the challenging terrain ahead. Most importantly, she established her first waypoint marker, a carefully constructed cairn of stacked stones that would serve as a reference point for her return journey. The descent into Devil's Canyon began deceptively easily. The floor of the wash was sandy and level, providing good footing for both horses. The walls rose gradually on either side, creating a sense of enclosure without immediate claustrophobia. Sarah Jane allowed herself to hope that perhaps the canyon's fearsome reputation was exaggerated, that careful navigation and proper preparation would be sufficient to ensure her success. That optimism lasted exactly 47 minutes. The first branching point appeared without warning as Sarah Jane rounded what seemed to be a gentle curve in the canyon floor. Where her maps indicated a single main channel continuing eastward, she found herself facing 4 distinct passages, each appearing equally viable and none corresponding to any documented route. Sarah Jane dismounted and spent 20 minutes studying each option, looking for indicators that might reveal which passage offered the best chance of reaching the canyon's interior water sources. The leftmost channel showed signs of recent water flow, mineral deposits and sand patterns that suggested seasonal flooding. The rightmost passage was wider and showed evidence of animal traffic, with tracks and scat indicating that wildlife used this route regularly. The 2 center passages were more enigmatic. One sloped upward slightly, potentially leading to elevated areas where she might gain better perspective on the overall canyon system. The other descended more steeply, following what appeared to be the natural drainage pattern that would logically lead to underground water sources. After careful consideration, Sarah Jane chose the descending center passage, reasoning that water always sought the lowest possible level and that underground rivers would most likely be found by following gravity's pull. She marked her decision with a second cairn and began leading Sage and Jasper down the increasingly narrow passage. Within an hour, Sarah Jane realized she had made her first serious navigational error. The passage narrowed steadily until it became impassable for mounted travel, forcing her to backtrack nearly a mile to reach the branching point again. The lost time was frustrating, but more troubling was the realization that Devil's Canyon was far more complex than her preliminary maps had suggested. Her second choice, the wider passage showing animal traffic, initially seemed more promising. The route remained wide enough for the animals, and the occasional deer tracks and bird droppings suggested this was indeed a viable path toward interior resources. But after 2 hours of steady travel, This passage also revealed its deception. The animal traffic, Sarah Jane discovered, belonged to creatures seeking shelter rather than water. The passage led to a series of caves and overhangs that provided excellent protection from weather, but showed no signs of water access. Worse, the passage ended in a sheer cliff face that would have required technical climbing equipment to navigate safely. By late afternoon, Sarah Jane was forced to accept a sobering reality. Her carefully researched maps were virtually useless once she entered Devil's Canyon's actual interior. The geological surveys had captured only the most general features of the canyon system, missing the crucial details that determined whether any particular route was navigable. As sunset approached, Sarah Jane found herself deeper in Devil's Canyon than she had planned for her first day, and in terrain far more challenging than her preparations had anticipated. The passage she was currently following, her third attempt at finding a viable route, showed promising signs of water access, but was too narrow and treacherous to navigate safely in darkness. The canyon walls now rose over 200 feet, on either side, creating a slot so narrow that direct sunlight reached the floor for only a few hours each day. The temperature differential between the sun-baked rim and the perpetually shadowed floor was dramatic, creating micro-weather patterns that changed constantly throughout the day. Sarah Jane established her first night camp in a small alcove that provided protection from potential flash floods while offering escape routes if emergency evacuation became necessary. The sheltered area was barely large enough for herself and the two animals, but it met her critical safety requirements. Elevated above the wash bottom, accessible to larger spaces if rapid movement became necessary, and positioned to capture morning sunlight for warmth and navigation reference. As darkness fell, the canyon's alien nature became even more pronounced. Sounds behaved strangely in the narrow space. Whispers seemed to carry for miles, while normal conversation was muffled and distorted. The usual desert chorus of coyotes, owls, and insects was replaced by an eerie symphony of wind moving through rock formations, creating tones and harmonics that had no equivalent in Sarah Jane's previous experience. Sage and Jasper showed signs of nervousness that concerned their experienced handler. Both animals were accustomed to sleeping in unfamiliar locations during Sarah Jane's regular expeditions, but the canyon environment clearly affected them in ways that normal desert camping did not. They stayed close to each other and to Sarah Jane, ears constantly moving as they monitored sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Sleep came fitfully for all three travelers. Sarah Jane found herself waking repeatedly to check her compass bearings and confirm that the carefully constructed rock markers she had placed around their camp remained undisturbed. Several times during the night, she heard sounds that seemed to indicate large-scale movement, not individual animals, but something more like landslides or structural collapse in distant parts of the canyon system. Dawn brought both relief and new challenges. The narrow slot of sky visible above their camp remained dark long after sunrise, delaying the warming and illumination that would make safe travel possible. When sunlight finally reached the canyon floor, it revealed that overnight winds had erased many of the tracks and markers Sarah Jane had used to navigate the previous day. More troubling, the morning light revealed geological features that hadn't been visible in the previous day's shadowy conditions. The passage ahead split again, this time into three routes that appeared to lead in completely different directions. Her compass readings, which should have provided reliable directional reference, seemed to be affected by mineral deposits in the surrounding rock, showing variations that made accurate navigation increasingly difficult. Sarah Jane's second day in Devil's Canyon began with a crucial decision that would determine whether her expedition succeeded or failed catastrophically. The three passages ahead offered dramatically different options, one that climbed toward what might be an exit route, one that continued deeper into the canyon system, and one that appeared to circle back toward areas she had already explored. The climbing route was tempting because it might provide the elevated perspective she desperately needed to understand the overall geography of the canyon system. But it was also the most dangerous option, requiring her to lead the animals up steep, rocky terrain, where a single misstep could result in injury or death. The deeper route followed what appeared to be the main drainage pattern, making it the most logical choice for finding underground water sources. But it also committed her to penetrating further into the canyon's heart, increasing the distance she would need to travel to reach safety if emergency evacuation became necessary. The circling route might allow her to approach familiar territory from a different angle, potentially revealing navigation options she had missed during her previous day's exploration. But it might also lead to endless repetition, trapping her in a geological maze with no productive outcome. After an hour of careful consideration, Sarah Jane chose the deeper route, reasoning that her primary mission was finding water sources, and that retreating towards safer but less productive areas would ultimately fail to solve her family's crisis. She marked her decision with another carefully constructed cairn and began leading her animals down the increasingly narrow passage. The descent was more challenging than anything Sarah Jane had previously encountered during her desert explorations. The passage floor was composed of loose sand and gravel that shifted unpredictably under the animal's weight, creating small avalanches that could potentially trigger larger rockfalls. The walls pressed closer together with each mile of travel, sometimes narrowing to barely 10 feet in width. Most concerning was the evidence of flash flood activity that became increasingly dramatic as they descended. Debris caught 20 feet above the current passage floor indicated water levels that would be instantly fatal to anything caught in the narrow space during a storm. Sarah Jane found herself constantly monitoring the sky for cloud formations, despite the fact that the visible strip above the canyon was too narrow to provide reliable weather information. By midday, Sarah Jane's party had descended over 300 feet below the canyon's rim level and traveled nearly 8 miles from their starting point. The passage had widened slightly, providing some relief from the claustrophobic pressure of the narrow slots. But the increased space came with new dangers. The wider canyon revealed the full scope of Devil's Canyon's complexity. Side passages branched off in every direction, some climbing toward hidden mesa tops, others descending into darkness that seemed to have no bottom. Ancient rockfalls had created barriers that required careful navigation to circumvent, and in several places the passage floor was interrupted by deep pools of standing water that might conceal quicksand or other hazards. Despite the navigational challenges and mounting dangers, Sarah Jane's second day in Devil's Canyon also brought the first confirmation that her expedition might achieve its primary objective. The standing water pools, while potentially hazardous, also indicated the presence of underground water sources substantial enough to maintain permanent surface expressions even during the current severe drought. Sarah Jane tested the water quality, using techniques her father had taught her for evaluating range water sources. The pools were alkaline and heavily mineralized, making them unsuitable for human consumption without treatment, but they demonstrated that substantial underground water systems were indeed present in the canyon's depths. More promising were the signs of seasonal water flow that became increasingly evident as they penetrated deeper into the canyon system. Ancient flood marks on the rock walls told stories of tremendous water volumes that moved through the passages during rare but intense storms. The mineral staining and erosion patterns suggested that these flood events recharged underground reservoirs that might provide sustainable water sources even during extended drought periods. Sarah Jane documented her observations with scientific precision, creating detailed sketches of geological formations and recording careful measurements of water levels, mineral content, and flow patterns. Her growing collection of data would be invaluable for planning water extraction operations if she succeeded in identifying viable sources and establishing access routes. But the scientific success was overshadowed by a growing realization that her expedition was becoming far more dangerous than she had anticipated. The canyon system was larger and more complex than any previous exploration had revealed. The navigation challenges were compounding with each mile of travel, and her planned 3-week supply schedule was being consumed faster than anticipated, due to the increased energy demands of difficult terrain. Most troubling was the psychological pressure of complete isolation in an environment that seemed actively hostile to human presence. The constantly changing acoustics, the disorienting effects of limited sky visibility, and the omnipresent evidence of catastrophic flood potential created a stress level that Sarah Jane had never experienced during her previous wilderness expeditions. As her second night in Devil's Canyon approached, Sarah Jane found herself facing a critical decision point. She had achieved her primary objective of confirming substantial underground water sources, but she had also discovered that accessing those sources would require far more extensive operations than her family could mount with their current resources. The question now was whether to continue deeper into the canyon system, seeking the major underground rivers that her observations suggested existed in the lowest levels, or to begin the challenging process of retracing her route while documenting the water sources she had already discovered. Sarah Jane's decision to continue deeper into Devil's Canyon was influenced by discoveries that seemed to confirm all her theoretical predictions about the area's water resources. Late on her second day, she found evidence of what appeared to be a major underground river system, not just seasonal pools and temporary flows, but permanent water sources that could sustain large-scale operations. The evidence was compelling. Year-round vegetation that required constant water access, bird and animal traffic that indicated regular watering schedules, and most convincingly, the sound of moving water that seemed to come from beneath the canyon floor itself. Following these indicators required venturing even further into the canyon's depths, but the potential rewards seemed to justify the increased risks. As Sarah Jane established her second night camp, she was approximately 12 miles from Devil's Canyon's entrance and nearly 500 feet below the rim level. The passage had widened into a small valley surrounded by towering walls that rose sheer and unclimbable toward the distant sky. It was beautiful in an alien way, but it was also a geological trap from which escape would require retracing every step of her increasingly complex route. The night brought new challenges that tested Sarah Jane's psychological reserves. Temperature drops were more extreme in the deep canyon, requiring her to use precious firewood to keep herself and the animals warm. The acoustic effects were even more pronounced, with every small sound amplified and distorted until normal desert. Noises became an unsettling symphony of echoes and reverberations. Most disturbing were the light phenomena that Sarah Jane observed but couldn't explain. Dancing reflections seemed to move across the canyon walls despite the absence of any obvious light source, and the starlight visible through the narrow opening above seemed to behave differently than in normal desert conditions. By morning of her third day, Sarah Jane had to acknowledge that she was no longer engaged in a standard exploration expedition. Devil's Canyon had revealed itself as something far more complex and dangerous than her research had suggested, and her survival was beginning to depend on skills and decisions that went far beyond her careful preparations. The maze was closing around her, and the way back was becoming as treacherous as the path ahead. Sarah Jane McKenna, who had entered Devil's Canyon as a confident young explorer, was discovering that some landscapes demanded more than skill and preparation. They demanded a willingness to be transformed by the experience of survival in places where human presence was neither welcomed nor easily sustained. As she prepared for her third day of descent into the canyon's heart, Sarah Jane could not have imagined that she was approaching the series of events that would separate her expedition from carefully planned exploration and transform it into a desperate struggle for survival that would test every lesson she had learned about the harsh and unforgiving beauty of the American Southwest. Dawn of Sarah Jane's third day brought an ominous change in the atmosphere that even the canyon's confusing acoustics couldn't disguise. The usual morning stillness was replaced by a subtle but persistent wind that seemed to flow down from the canyon rim, carrying with it the scent of moisture and distant storm activity. For someone with Sarah Jane's extensive knowledge of desert weather patterns, these signs were as clear as written warnings. High above the narrow strip of visible sky, clouds were building in formations that Sarah Jane recognized as potentially catastrophic for anyone trapped in a canyon system. The clouds weren't the typical scattered thunderheads of normal desert storms, but the massive towering formations that indicated major weather systems moving in from the Pacific. These were the kinds of storms that could dump inches of rain in minutes across vast watersheds, sending walls of water through drainage systems hundreds of miles from the actual precipitation. Sarah Jane's barometer confirmed what her instincts already knew. Atmospheric pressure was dropping rapidly, indicating the approach of a significant storm system. But the readings were more dramatic than anything she had recorded during her years of weather observation. The pressure drop suggested not just a severe thunderstorm, but a major frontal system that could bring sustained rainfall across the entire Colorado Plateau. The implications were terrifying. Devil's Canyon served as a drainage system for over 200 square miles of high desert country. Rain falling on distant mesas and plateaus would eventually find its way into the canyon network, creating flash floods that could rise 50 feet or more above normal water levels. The geological evidence Sarah Jane had observed during her descent, debris caught high on canyon walls, smooth carved channels in solid rock, mineral staining that reached impossible heights, suddenly took on new and urgent meaning. She had perhaps 2 hours, maybe 3 at most, before the first storm runoff would begin reaching the deep canyon sections where she was currently located. The question was whether 2 hours would be sufficient time to reach higher ground or find shelter that could protect her party from what was coming. Sarah Jane's years of desert experience had taught her that the cardinal rule of survival in canyon country was simple: never remain in a drainage system when storms threatened. But her current location, nearly 13 miles from the canyon entrance and over 500 feet below rim level, made immediate evacuation impossible. The route she had followed to reach this depth was far too complex and time-consuming to reverse quickly. Her only option was to find higher ground within the canyon system itself, a solution that might protect her from the immediate flood danger, but could trap her even more completely in the geological maze that Devil's Canyon had revealed itself to be. Sarah Jane spent precious minutes studying the canyon walls around, her current position searching for any route that might lead to elevations above the potential flood zone. The sheer sandstone faces rose dramatically on all sides, but careful observation revealed a possible escape route, a narrow ledge system that switchbacked up the northern wall toward what appeared to be a series of caves or alcoves about 200 feet above the canyon floor. The route was dangerous under the best of circumstances, requiring her to lead sage and jasper up terrain that was never intended for horse travel. The ledges were narrow, crumbling in places, and interrupted by gaps that would require careful jumping or climbing to cross. But it was the only option that offered any chance of reaching safety before the floods arrived. Sarah Jane reorganized her equipment with desperate efficiency, transferring only the most essential supplies to her personal pack while redistributing weight on the animals to improve their balance for the challenging climb. Every item had to be secured against loss. A dropped piece of equipment could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe in the isolated environment where she was now trapped. The climb began with deceptive ease, as the first sections of the ledge system provided adequate footing for the sure-footed desert horses. But as they gained elevation, the route became increasingly treacherous. The ledges narrowed to barely 3 feet in width, with sheer drops to the canyon floor on one side and vertical rock walls on the other. Sage, despite her mountain training and natural agility, showed increasing signs of stress as the route demanded maneuvers that pushed the limits of equine capability. The paint mare's breathing became labored not from exertion but from the psychological pressure of navigating terrain where a single misstep would be fatal. Jasper, the pack mule, proved even more challenging to manage on the narrow ledges. His larger size and heavier load made him less maneuverable than Sage, and his naturally cautious temperament made him increasingly reluctant to follow Sarah Jane's lead as the route became more extreme. Halfway up the cliff face, disaster struck. With the sudden violence that characterized all emergencies in desert country, a section of ledge that had appeared solid crumbled under Jasper's weight, sending a cascade of rocks tumbling toward the canyon floor and leaving the mule stranded on a projection barely large enough to support his body. Sarah Jane found herself facing an impossible choice with precious time running out before the storm arrived. She could attempt a dangerous rescue that might save Jasper, but would certainly prevent her from reaching adequate elevation before the floods hit. Or she could abandon the mule and continue climbing with Sage, preserving their own lives but sacrificing the supplies and equipment that Jasper carried. The decision was made for her by the mule himself. Jasper, panicked by his precarious position and the unstable footing, attempted to leap across the gap created by the ledge collapse. The jump was almost successful. His front hooves reached the continuing ledge system, but his hind legs slipped on the crumbling sandstone, and his weight proved too much for the weakened rock formation. Sarah Jane watched in horror as Jasper fell, tumbling down the cliff face in a slide of loose rock and scattered equipment. The mule's body struck several projections during the fall, and by the time he reached the canyon floor, Sarah Jane knew that her faithful companion was dead, and that half of her essential supplies were scattered across the rocks below. The loss of Jasper was devastating, both practically and emotionally, but Sarah Jane couldn't afford the luxury of grief with the storm approaching rapidly. She continued the climb with Sage, moving as quickly as safety allowed while constantly monitoring the sky for signs of the flood's arrival. The caves Sarah Jane had spotted from below proved to be more extensive than she had hoped. A series of connected chambers that penetrated deep into the canyon wall, offering protection not just from floodwaters, but from the rain and wind that would accompany the storm. The main chamber was large enough to accommodate both Sarah Jane and Sage, with adequate ventilation and a sandy floor that would provide reasonable comfort during what might be an extended period of shelter. Sarah Jane had barely finished moving her remaining supplies into the cave when the first signs of the approaching flood became audible. A low rumble echoed through the canyon system, growing steadily louder as millions of gallons of storm runoff funneled through the narrow passages. She had traveled during her descent. From her elevated position, Sarah Jane watched in awe and terror as Devil's Canyon revealed its true power. The trickle of water that had meandered along the canyon floor was replaced within minutes by a raging torrent that filled the passage from wall to wall. Trees, boulders, and debris swept past at tremendous speed, carried by a force that could have pulverized anything caught in its path. The water level rose with shocking rapidity, climbing toward the elevation where Sarah Jane had established her emergency shelter. At its peak, the flood reached within 30 feet of her cave entrance, close enough that spray from the turbulent water created a fine mist that drifted into her shelter. If she had remained on the canyon floor even 5 minutes longer, she and Sage would have been swept away like pieces of driftwood. The flood's duration was as impressive as its violence. For over 6 hours, water continued to pour through Devil's Canyon with a consistency that indicated massive and sustained rainfall. Across the entire watershed, the acoustic effect was overwhelming, a constant roar that made communication impossible and created psychological pressure that tested Sarah Jane's ability to remain calm in an already stressful situation. When the water finally began to recede, it revealed a canyon transformed beyond recognition. The familiar landmarks Sarah Jane had used for navigation were gone, swept away or buried under tons of debris. The careful cairns and markers she had placed to guide her return journey had vanished without a trace. Most critically, the route she had followed to reach this depth was completely obliterated, replaced by new rock formations, debris fields, and changed topography that bore no resemblance to the passages she had traveled. As the floodwaters drained away and Sarah Jane ventured cautiously from her shelter to assess the situation, she faced the full magnitude of her predicament. The flood had not just damaged her planned route, it had fundamentally altered the geography of Devil's Canyon, creating an entirely new landscape that bore no relationship to her maps or previous observations. The canyon floor, which had been relatively level sand and gravel, was now a chaos of boulder fields, debris piles, and newly carved channels that followed completely different drainage patterns. Passages that had been open were now blocked by massive rock falls, while new openings had been carved through previously solid formations. Most devastating was the realization that many of her navigation landmarks, distinctive rock formations, mineral staining patterns, and geological features she had used to maintain her bearings, were either destroyed or so altered that they no longer provided reliable reference points. Sarah Jane found herself effectively lost in a place that looked nothing like the canyon she had been exploring for the past 3 days. Her remaining supplies, reduced by half with Jasper's death, were now grossly inadequate for the extended period of exploration that would be required to find a new route to safety. The careful calculations that had planned for a 3-week expedition with adequate safety margins were meaningless in a situation where basic navigation had become impossible. Water, ironically, was no longer a concern. The flood had left numerous pools and catchments filled with fresh rainwater, and the geological formations that had indicated underground water sources were now accessible and flowing freely. But water meant nothing without the ability to find a way out of the canyon system. Food was a more immediate problem. Sarah Jane's remaining supplies would last perhaps 10 days with careful rationing, but only if she avoided the increased caloric demands that would come with extensive exploration in difficult terrain. The physical demands of finding a new route out of the transformed canyon would accelerate her consumption of vital nutrients just when those resources were most critically limited. Perhaps more challenging than the practical difficulties was the psychological impact of finding herself completely cut off from any connection to the familiar world. Sarah Jane had always been independent and self-reliant, comfortable with solitude during her regular expeditions, but this was isolation of a different order entirely. She was trapped in a place that no other human being had ever seen, where no maps existed, and where rescue would be impossible even if search parties knew exactly where to look. The silence that had seemed merely unusual during her first days in the canyon now became oppressive. With the flood's roar finally faded, Devil's Canyon returned to its unnatural quiet, but the quality of the silence had changed. It felt heavier, more complete, as if the canyon had somehow become even more isolated from the outside world. Sage, too, showed signs of psychological stress that concerned Sarah Jane. The mare had always been sensitive to environmental changes, and the traumatic flood experience combined with the loss of Jasper had clearly affected her behavior. She stayed close to Sarah Jane constantly, nickering softly whenever her human companion moved out of sight, and showed reluctance to venture far from their cave shelter, even when foraging for the sparse vegetation available in their elevated location. Sleep became elusive for both human and horse. The cave that had seemed like salvation during the flood now felt like a tomb, isolated from any external stimuli that might provide psychological relief from the oppressive sense of entrapment. Sarah Jane found herself starting awake repeatedly during the night, listening for sounds that might indicate changing conditions or approaching threats. Dreams, when they came, were filled with images of endless maze-like passages, rising water, and the terrifying realization of being forever lost in geological formations that shifted and changed whenever she wasn't looking directly at them. Sarah Jane woke from these dreams, with her heart racing and her body covered in cold sweat, despite the desert night's chill. Despite the psychological challenges, Sarah Jane forced herself to begin systematic exploration of her changed environment. If there was a way out of Devil's Canyon, she would find it through the same methodical approach that had guided her scientific work throughout her young life. She established a base camp in the cave that had saved her life, creating supply caches and reference points that would allow her to venture out on day-long scouting expeditions while maintaining a secure fallback position. Each morning, she selected a different direction for exploration, carefully mapping the new topography and searching for passages that might lead toward the canyon rim or connect to less severely altered areas. The exploration revealed the full scope of the challenge she faced. The flood had created a landscape that seemed designed to confuse and disorient. Passages that appeared to lead in promising directions would suddenly end in impassable rockfalls or newly carved cliffs. Routes that looked clearly navigable from a distance proved to be optical illusions created by the canyon's complex geometry. Most frustrating were the discoveries of what appeared to be viable escape routes that led ultimately to dead ends or circular paths that returned her to areas she had already explored. The canyon seemed to be playing tricks with her sense of direction and distance, creating the illusion of progress while actually trapping her more completely in its geological maze. After a week of systematic exploration, Sarah Jane was forced to accept that finding a quick route to safety was unlikely. The flood had created a landscape that would require extensive time and resources to navigate successfully, and her remaining supplies were diminishing faster than her exploration was producing results. Faced with the reality that her expedition had transformed from planned exploration to indefinite survival situation, Sarah Jane made the crucial mental adjustment that would determine whether she lived or died in Devil's Canyon. She stopped thinking like an explorer with a planned return schedule and began thinking like a long-term resident of a harsh but habitable environment. The psychological shift was as important as any practical change in her routine. Instead of focusing on immediate escape, Sarah Jane began treating her canyon prison as a place where she would need to establish sustainable living conditions for an unknown period of time. This mental adjustment reduced the constant stress of urgent time pressure while allowing her to make more rational decisions about resource allocation and risk management. Water sources, abundant after the flood, became the foundation of her long-term planning. Sarah Jane identified 3 reliable springs within reasonable distance of her cave shelter, ensuring that water collection could be maintained even if weather conditions or geological changes affected individual sources. Food procurement required more creative solutions. The canyon's new topography had created microclimates that supported different types of vegetation, some of which Sarah Jane recognized as edible from her extensive study of desert survival techniques. She began systematic gathering and testing of plant materials, carefully building a knowledge base of safe and nutritious foods available in her immediate environment. Most importantly, Sarah Jane established routines and goals that provided psychological structure during what could be an extended period of isolation. She maintained detailed journals of her daily activities, continued her scientific observations of the canyon's geological and ecological features, and set regular schedules for equipment maintenance, shelter improvement, and physical exercise. Transformation from lost explorer to long-term survivor represented a fundamental change in Sarah Jane's relationship with Devil's Canyon. Instead of seeing the canyon as an obstacle to overcome, she began to understand it as an environment to adapt to and ultimately master through patience, observation, and the gradual accumulation of knowledge that would eventually reveal its secrets. But adaptation was only the first step toward survival. In the weeks ahead, Sarah Jane would face challenges that would test not just her practical skills, but her ability to maintain hope and sanity in a place where time seemed to have stopped and where the outside world felt like something from a half-remembered dream. The same massive storm system that trapped Sarah Jane in Devil's Canyon struck the McKenna Ranch with unprecedented fury just after midnight on October 6th. Patrick McKenna stood at the parlor window, watching lightning illuminate sheets of rain that fell harder than he had ever witnessed in 23 years of Arizona ranching. The drought that had plagued the territory for 7 months was ending with a vengeance that seemed determined to make up for lost time in a single catastrophic event. But Patrick's concerns extended far beyond the immediate damage to his ranch. Operations. Sarah Jane had been gone for 3 days, with instructions to return by October 5th, or signal for assistance if her timeline extended beyond the planned schedule. The storm now raging across the territory made any communication impossible and transformed what should have been a routine check-in into a source of growing dread. Bridget McKenna sat at the kitchen table with maps spread before her, calculating distances and travel times with the methodical precision that characterized all her approaches to crisis management. Her Irish practicality refused to acknowledge worst-case scenarios until facts demanded such consideration. But her maternal instincts were screaming warnings that became harder to ignore with each hour of silence from Devil's Canyon. Michael and James McKenna maintained the ranch's emergency operations throughout the storm, ensuring that livestock reached shelter and that the buildings essential to their survival remained intact against wind gusts that exceeded anything in their experience. But both young men frequently paused in their work to scan the horizon for any sign of their sister's return, knowing that the storm conditions made travel impossible for anyone caught in the open. Mary Catherine McKenna handled the horses with her usual skill, but even she couldn't completely hide her anxiety about Sage's absence. The paint mare was more than just Sarah Jane's preferred mount. She was a highly intelligent animal whose survival instincts had been proven repeatedly during dangerous situations. If Sage was still with Sarah Jane, there was reason for hope. But the storm was severe enough to challenge even the most experienced desert travelers. The McKenna family spent the night in alternating periods of ranch emergency management and worried speculation about Sarah Jane's whereabouts. Dawn brought clearer skies, but also the sobering realization that their daughter and sister was now officially overdue, with no word about her status or location. Patrick McKenna began organizing search operations before the storm waters had finished draining from the immediate ranch area. His years of territorial experience had taught him that time was the most critical factor in wilderness rescue situations, and that every hour of delay reduced the chances of finding missing persons alive and uninjured. The first challenge was assembling a search team with the skills necessary to operate effectively in Devil's Canyon's treacherous terrain. Most of the McKenna ranch hands were excellent cowboys and competent outdoorsmen, but canyon navigation required specialized knowledge that few possessed. Devil's Canyon demanded trackers who could read sign in conditions where normal footprints might be invisible, and who understood the complex geology that made the area so dangerous. Patrick's first recruit was Tom Harrison, the former Army scout, who had worked in Arizona Territory for 15 years and possessed extensive experience with search and rescue operations. Harrison had participated in military campaigns against Apache bands throughout the 1870s and had developed tracking skills that were legendary among territorial law enforcement agencies. Harrison's assessment of the search challenges was sobering, but not hopeless. Devil's Canyon, after a major storm, is like trying to read a book where half the pages have been torn out and the rest have been rewritten, he explained to the assembled McKenna family. But the girl knows desert survival better than most grown men, and she's got the best horse in the territory. If anyone can survive in there, it's Sarah Jane. The second critical addition to the search team was Roberto Vasquez, a vaquero whose family had worked cattle in the Sonoran Desert for 3 generations. Vasquez possessed an almost supernatural ability to locate water sources and read weather patterns, skills that would be essential for predicting where Sarah Jane might have sought shelter during the storm. But the most crucial member of the search team was recommended by Tom Harrison after a day of frustrating attempts to pick up Sarah Jane's trail in the storm-altered landscape surrounding Devil's Canyon. "We need someone who can read sign that the storm didn't wash away," Harrison told Patrick McKenna, "someone who sees things the rest of us miss." Greyhawk operated a small trading post 20 miles north of the McKenna Ranch, serving the scattered mining camps and isolated homesteads that dotted the territorial landscape. But his reputation extended far beyond simple commerce. He was known throughout Arizona Territory as a tracker whose skills bordered on the mystical, a man who could follow trails that existed more in intuition than in physical evidence. Greyhawk was the son of a Crow woman and a Scottish trader, raised in both worlds, but fully accepted by neither. His mother's people had taught him to read the subtle signs that revealed the passage of humans and animals across even the most challenging terrain. His father had provided him with formal education and business skills that allowed him to operate successfully in the white settlements that increasingly dominated territorial commerce. At 35, Greyhawk had established himself as an indispensable resource for law enforcement agencies, military units, and civilian organizations that needed tracking services in the vast and often hostile landscape of the American Southwest. His success rate in finding missing persons was remarkable, but more importantly, he had never abandoned a search, regardless of the challenges involved. Tom Harrison's approach to Greyhawk was both respectful and direct. "Patrick McKenna's daughter has been missing in Devil's Canyon for 4 days, he explained. "The storm washed out most of the sign, and we're running out of time to find her alive." Greyhawk listened without interruption as Harrison described Sarah Jane's experience level, her equipment, and the probable routes she might have taken into the canyon system. When Harrison finished, Greyhawk asked only one question. What kind of person is she? Harrison considered the question carefully before answering. Independent, intelligent, and tougher than most men twice her age. But she's also methodical and careful, not likely to take unnecessary risks. Greyhawk nodded slowly. The canyon speaks differently after big storms, but people leave other kinds of signs that water cannot wash away. We will find her. The search party that entered Devil's Canyon on October 8th was unlike any group that had previously attempted to navigate its treacherous interior. Greyhawk rode point, his eyes constantly scanning the transformed landscape for signs that others would never notice. Tom Harrison provided military precision and logistical coordination. Roberto Vasquez contributed desert survival expertise and weather prediction. Patrick McKenna brought intimate knowledge of his daughter's capabilities and psychology. The storm's impact on Devil's Canyon was even more dramatic than the searchers had anticipated. Familiar landmarks had disappeared, replaced by debris fields and newly carved channels that bore no resemblance to existing maps. The careful cairns and trail markers that Sarah Jane had constructed during her descent were completely obliterated, leaving no obvious indication of her chosen route. But Greyhawk possessed tracking skills that operated on different principles than simple footprint analysis. He studied the canyon's transformed topography with an understanding that went beyond immediate physical evidence, reading the story of the storm's impact in ways that revealed where a careful traveler might have sought shelter or chosen alternative routes. She came this way, Greyhawk announced, after studying an area that looked completely unremarkable to the other searchers. 3 days before the storm, moving slowly, studying the terrain carefully. Tom Harrison examined the same area and could detect no sign of human passage. How can you tell? Greyhawk pointed to subtle disturbances in rock placement and vegetation patterns that had survived the storm's violence. Horses step differently when their riders are concentrating on navigation rather than speed. These patterns remain even after water changes the surface features. The search party's progress was slower than any of them had hoped, but Greyhawk's tracking revealed a consistent pattern of careful, methodical exploration that characterized Sarah Jane's approach to wilderness travel. She had indeed penetrated deep into Devil's Canyon, following logical routes toward the water sources that had motivated her original expedition. By the afternoon of their first day in Devil's Canyon, the search party reached areas where the storm's impact revealed its true destructive power. Debris lines 20 feet above the current canyon floor told stories of flood levels that would have been instantly fatal to anyone caught in the drainage system during the peak flow period. Roberto Vasquez studied the flood evidence with growing concern. The water rose faster and higher than anything I have seen in 30 years of desert experience, he reported to the group. If the señorita was in the main channel when this happened, but Greyhawk was examining different evidence. That suggested a more hopeful scenario. She reached this area before the storm, he announced, pointing to protected areas where subtle signs of human and horse passage had survived the flood. But she also understood the danger. Look here. These are the tracks of someone moving quickly toward higher ground. The search party followed Greyhawk's lead up a steep slope that paralleled the main canyon channel, climbing toward areas that would have provided safety during the flood. The route was treacherous even under current conditions, requiring considerable skill to navigate with horses. This is where she made her stand against the storm, Greyhawk said, as they reached a series of caves and alcoves carved into the canyon wall. The girl chose well. This elevation would have protected her from the worst flooding. Tom Harrison examined the caves carefully, looking for evidence of recent human occupation. In the largest chamber, he discovered clear signs that someone, had sheltered there during the storm, areas where a fire had been built, arrangements of rocks that suggested organized camp setup, and most encouragingly, horse droppings that were consistent with Sage's size and diet. She survived the flood, Harrison announced with relief evident in his voice. The question now is where she went afterward. The discovery that Sarah Jane had successfully weathered the storm provided enormous psychological relief to the search party, but it also revealed the magnitude of the challenge they still faced. The flood had so completely altered Devil's Canyon's geography that normal tracking methods were virtually useless for determining where Sarah Jane might have gone after leaving her storm shelter. Greyhawk spent hours studying the terrain around the cave complex, searching for any indication of Sarah Jane's post-storm movements. The task was complicated by the fact that the flood had created numerous new routes and blocked others, making it impossible to determine which direction a logical traveler might have chosen. The water changed everything, Greyhawk explained to Patrick McKenna. Your daughter left the cave after the storm passed, but the ground no longer tells the story of where she went. We must think like she thinks, understand what she would do in this situation. Patrick considered what he knew about Sarah Jane's personality and decision-making patterns. She would have tried to return home by the most direct route available. But if that was blocked, she would have looked for alternative ways out of the canyon system. Roberto Vasquez contributed his knowledge of post-flood behavior in desert environments. After big storms, the safest strategy is often to stay in one area until conditions stabilize. Moving too quickly in changed terrain can lead to accidents or getting more deeply lost. But Tom Harrison's military experience suggested a different possibility. If Sarah Jane realized that the flood had cut off her planned return route, she might have decided to explore deeper into the canyon system, looking for alternative exits. A person with her skills wouldn't just sit and wait for rescue. The three theories, attempted return, staying put, or deeper exploration, required completely different search strategies. Splitting the party would allow them to investigate multiple possibilities, but would also reduce their effectiveness in the challenging terrain and potentially create additional safety risks. As the search party struggled with strategic decisions, word of Sarah Jane's disappearance was spreading throughout the territorial community. The McKenna family's reputation for integrity and community assistance had earned them allies throughout Arizona territory, and news of their crisis brought offers of help from unexpected sources. The Territorial Marshal's Office dispatched additional personnel to coordinate search efforts and provide official law enforcement support. Mining companies contributed equipment and manpower for large-scale operations. Even competing ranchers set aside business rivalries to participate in the search for Patrick McKenna's daughter. But perhaps the most significant assistance came from sources that surprised everyone involved. Apache families, who traded occasionally with Greyhawk, sent word that they would provide information about canyon conditions and alternative routes that didn't appear on any territorial maps. Their knowledge of the area's hidden geography could prove invaluable for understanding where Sarah Jane might have gone. Mexican vaqueros from ranches south of the border offered tracking expertise that complemented Greyhawk's skills. These men possessed generational knowledge of desert survival and navigation that had been passed down through families who had worked the land since before territorial boundaries existed. The expansion of search efforts created coordination challenges, but also multiplied the chances of finding Sarah Jane alive. Multiple teams could investigate different areas simultaneously, and the diverse expertise of the searchers meant that subtle clues might be noticed that would escape the attention of any single group. While the organized search efforts provided structure and hope, the psychological impact on the McKenna family was becoming increasingly severe. Patrick McKenna maintained his role as search coordinator with characteristic Irish stoicism, but the strain of leadership during family crisis was evident in his increasingly haggard appearance and shortened temper. Bridget McKenna channeled her anxiety into practical support activities, maintaining constant food preparation for search teams and correspondence with territorial authorities. But her nights were sleepless vigils, marked by repetitive prayers and desperate bargaining with whatever divine forces might influence her daughter's fate. Michael and James McKenna balanced ranch operations with active participation in search activities, but both young men were struggling with feelings of helplessness that challenged their usual confidence in solving problems through hard work and determination. Sarah Jane's disappearance was a crisis that couldn't be resolved through conventional approaches. Mary Catherine McKenna perhaps suffered most acutely because her special bond with horses made Sage's absence a constant reminder of the family's loss. The paint mare's intelligence and loyalty meant that her failure to return home suggested either that she was physically unable to travel or that she was choosing to remain with Sarah Jane in circumstances too dangerous for independent movement. Community support that had mobilized to assist the search efforts provided some comfort to the McKenna family, but also created additional pressure. The knowledge that dozens of people were risking their own safety to find Sarah Jane intensified the family's sense of responsibility and guilt about her disappearance. As the search efforts expanded and organized into systematic coverage of Devil's Canyon's vast area, Greyhawk began developing theories about Sarah Jane's situation that went beyond simple tracking analysis. His understanding of human psychology in survival situations, combined with his knowledge of the canyon's hidden geography, suggested possibilities that hadn't occurred to the other searchers. "The girl is alive," Greyhawk told Patrick McKenna during a planning session on their third day of searching. "But she is not simply lost or injured waiting for rescue. She is adapting to long-term survival in an environment that has become her temporary home." Patrick looked up from the maps he had been studying. "What makes you think that?" Greyhawk explained his reasoning with the methodical precision that characterized all his analytical work. "Someone with her skills would have found a way to signal for help if she was in an area where signals could be seen. The fact that we have detected no emergency signals suggests she is in a location where such signals would be useless, probably deep in the canyon system where visual communication with the outside world is impossible." The implications of Greyhawk's analysis were both encouraging and troubling. If Sarah Jane was indeed adapting to long-term survival rather than simply enduring until rescue, it suggested she was alive and thinking clearly. But it also meant that finding her would require understanding not just where she had gone, but how she was thinking about her situation and what strategies she was employing for indefinite survival. "We need to search for someone who is living in the canyon, not someone who is lost in it," Greyhawk concluded. "That changes everything about how we approach this problem." The search for Sarah Jane McKenna was about to enter a new phase that would test not just the tracking skills of her rescuers, but their ability to think like a person who had crossed the line from victim to survivor in one of the American Southwest's most challenging environments. 2 weeks into her unplanned residence in Devil's Canyon, Sarah Jane made a discovery that would transform her survival situation from desperate endurance to something approaching sustainable living. While exploring a series of passages that had been opened by the flood's geological restructuring, she detected the unmistakable sound of substantial water flow coming from beneath the canyon floor itself. The sound was different from the temporary runoff and pool systems she had been relying on for water. This was the consistent, powerful flow of a major underground river, exactly the kind of substantial water source that had originally motivated her expedition into Devil's Canyon. But accessing it would require navigating through newly formed cave systems that presented their own unique dangers and challenges. The entrance to the underground system was a crack in the canyon floor that had been widened by the flood's tremendous hydraulic pressure. The opening was barely large enough for a person to squeeze through, but once inside, it opened into a vast subterranean chamber where an underground river flowed through polished limestone formations that had been carved by water action over thousands of years. Sarah Jane's first exploration of the underground river system was limited by her available light sources and the need to maintain connection to her surface camp. But even her preliminary investigation revealed that this was a substantial water system that could support not just her individual survival needs, but potentially the water requirements of her family's entire ranch operation. The underground river was fed by springs that emerged from deep geological formations, creating a water source that was completely independent of surface rainfall and drought conditions. The water was clean, cold, and abundant, everything that the drought-stricken territory desperately needed. But more importantly for Sarah Jane's immediate survival, the underground chamber provided shelter that was far superior to anything available on the canyon's surface. The temperature remained constant year-round, the space was protected from weather extremes, and the flowing water created air circulation that kept the environment comfortable even during the hottest desert days. Sarah Jane spent 3 days carefully planning the relocation of her camp to the underground chamber. The move required lowering equipment through the narrow entrance crack, establishing secure routes between the surface and underground areas, and creating safety systems that would allow her to escape quickly if flooding or other emergencies made the underground space dangerous. The underground river chamber became Sarah Jane's base of operations for what she now accepted would be an extended period of residence in Devil's Canyon. She approached the challenge of underground living with the same systematic methodology that had characterized all her scientific work, treating her situation as a complex engineering problem that could be solved through careful observation and creative application of available resources. The chamber's natural features provided many advantages for long-term habitation. A sandy beach area near the river's edge offered level ground for sleeping and equipment storage. Natural stone shelves carved by ancient water levels created storage areas that were elevated above potential flood zones. Most importantly, the chamber had multiple entrances and exits, ensuring that she wouldn't be trapped if any single access route became blocked. Sarah Jane constructed furniture and storage systems using driftwood and debris that the flood had deposited throughout the cave system. Her knife and basic tools allowed her to shape materials into functional items that made underground living increasingly comfortable. She created a sleeping platform elevated above the cave floor, built storage containers that protected her remaining supplies from moisture, and established a cooking area with proper ventilation to prevent smoke accumulation. The most challenging aspect of underground living was managing light sources. Sarah Jane's limited supply of candles and lamp oil had to be carefully rationed to ensure she could maintain essential activities while preserving resources for critical situations. She experimented with reflective systems using polished metal surfaces to maximize the effectiveness of minimal light sources, and established routines that took advantage of natural light filtering through the entrance cracks during peak daylight hours. Food procurement required adapting her gathering strategies to the unique ecosystem of the underground environment. The constant moisture and stable temperatures had created micro-environments where edible plants grew in patterns completely different from surface desert vegetation. Sarah Jane discovered edible roots, fungal growth that provided protein, and mineral deposits that supplemented her nutritional needs. More importantly, the underground river supported aquatic life that could provide substantial protein sources if Sarah Jane could develop effective fishing techniques using her limited equipment. Small fish, freshwater crustaceans, and other aquatic species offered opportunities for protein procurement that didn't exist in the surface desert environment. While Sarah Jane was establishing her underground homestead, Greyhawk was experiencing his own breakthrough in the search efforts that had been frustrating the rescue teams for over 2 weeks. His analysis of subtle environmental changes throughout Devil's Canyon had revealed patterns that suggested human presence in areas that showed no obvious signs of habitation. The key insight came from observing bird and small animal behavior in areas where the search teams had found no direct evidence of human activity. Wildlife patterns throughout the canyon had been disrupted by the flood, but in certain locations, animal behavior suggested the presence of a stable food source or safe water access that couldn't be explained by known geological features. Greyhawk spent 3 days systematically observing these wildlife patterns, noting which areas attracted regular animal traffic and which seemed to be avoided despite apparently suitable habitat conditions. His analysis revealed that animals were traveling to specific locations on regular schedules, suggesting reliable resources that weren't visible from surface observation. The breakthrough came when Greyhawk noticed that birds entering certain areas of the canyon did not emerge for much longer periods than would be required for simple water access or foraging. The timing patterns suggested that the birds were accessing resources in locations that were somehow protected or concealed from surface observation. "She has found something that we cannot see from above," Greyhawk explained to Tom Harrison during their evening planning session. "The animals know where she is, even if we do not." Harrison studied the maps where Greyhawk had marked the areas of unusual animal activity. "You think she's gone underground?" Greyhawk nodded slowly. "The flood changed more than just surface features. It opened new passages, connected systems that were previously separate. Someone with her geological knowledge would recognize opportunities that we might miss." The theory that Sarah Jane had discovered underground access was both encouraging and troubling. If she had found substantial shelter and water sources, her survival prospects were excellent. But underground locations would make her virtually impossible to locate using conventional search methods, and could trap her in places where rescue would be extremely difficult, even if searchers knew her exact location. Greyhawk's tracking theories received unexpected confirmation from intelligence provided by Apache families who had been quietly monitoring the search efforts. The Apache possessed knowledge of Devil's Canyon's hidden geography that extended back through generations of careful observation, and their information revealed underground systems that didn't appear on any territorial maps. The Apache spokesman, an elderly man known as Stone Bear, met with Greyhawk at a location well away from the main search camps. The conversation took place in a mixture of Apache, Spanish, and English that reflected the complex cultural boundaries of territorial Arizona. "The canyon has deep places that white maps do not show," Stone Bear explained to Greyhawk. "Places where water flows beneath stone, where people can live hidden from skywatchers. The big water 2 weeks ago opened some of these places, closed others." Stone Bear's description of the underground systems matched Greyhawk's theories about Sarah Jane's possible location. The Apache had used these hidden areas for shelter during conflicts with both Mexican and American military forces, and their knowledge of access routes and safety considerations was detailed and reliable. If the young woman found these places, she could live there through many seasons, Stone Bear continued, but finding her would require understanding which openings the big water made safe, which it made dangerous. The Apache offered to guide a small search party to areas where underground access was most likely, but they insisted that the group be limited to people who could move quietly and respect the sacred nature of certain locations. The collaboration would require careful cultural negotiation, but it offered the best hope of actually locating Sarah Jane. Greyhawk's request for Apache assistance created controversy within the search organization. Some of the territorial authorities were reluctant to acknowledge Apache knowledge or accept their participation in official rescue operations. But Patrick McKenna immediately supported any approach that might find his daughter, regardless of political complications. "I don't care if we have to work with the devil himself," Patrick declared during a heated planning meeting. "Sarah Jane is alive somewhere in that canyon, and if the Apache can help us find her, then we work with the Apache." The expedition that departed for Devil's Canyon's unexplored depths on October 22nd was unlike any search effort that had been organized during the territorial period. Greyhawk led the group, accompanied by Stone Bear and 2 younger Apache, men whose knowledge of underground navigation complemented their tracking skills. Tom Harrison provided military coordination and emergency equipment. Roberto Vasquez contributed desert survival expertise that would be essential for extended operations in challenging terrain. Patrick McKenna insisted on participating despite concerns about the physical demands and cultural sensitivities involved. His knowledge of Sarah Jane's capabilities and decision-making patterns could prove crucial for understanding her choices in survival situations, and his motivation was unquestionable. The expedition carried equipment specifically selected for underground exploration, extensive rope systems for rappelling and climbing, multiple light sources with backup supplies, emergency communication devices, and medical equipment for treating injuries that might occur in cave environments. They also carried supplies for an extended search that might last several weeks if Sarah Jane was indeed living in underground locations. The Apache guides led the expedition to areas of Devil's Canyon that none of the previous search efforts had explored. These locations required technical climbing skills to access and showed no obvious signs of human presence from surface observation. But Stone Bear's knowledge of geological indicators revealed subtle evidence of underground water systems and cave networks. The Big Water opened a passage here that was closed for many seasons, Stone Bear explained, as he pointed to a crack in the canyon floor that looked insignificant to the other searchers. This connects to the deep places where water flows through stone. Greyhawk examined the crack with the careful attention that characterized all his tracking work. The opening showed subtle signs of recent disturbance, small rock movements and vegetation changes that suggested someone had passed through the area. More importantly, the acoustic properties of the crack indicated substantial open space below ground. "Someone has been here," Greyhawk announced after completing his analysis. "Recently, and more than once. This is not a single passage. This is a route that someone uses regularly." The descent into Devil's Canyon's underground systems required technical skills that pushed the limits of what the search party could accomplish safely. The crack that Stone Bear had identified led to a complex network of passages that had been carved by underground water flow over geological time periods. Some passages were large enough for easy human travel, while others required crawling through spaces barely wide enough for a person's body. Greyhawk led the underground pursuit with the methodical patience that had made him legendary throughout Arizona territory. Every few yards he paused to examine the cave walls and floor for signs of human passage. In underground environments, such signs were often more durable than surface evidence, protected from weather and preserved in the stable cave atmosphere. The first definitive evidence of Sarah Jane's presence came after nearly 2 hours of underground travel. Greyhawk discovered a section of cave wall where someone had scratched marks that appeared to be navigation references, symbols that would help a person find their way through the complex passage network. "She is here," Greyhawk announced, studying the carved symbols with satisfaction. "These marks show someone mapping the cave system, learning the routes. This is not the work of someone who is lost. This is someone who is making this place home." Tom Harrison examined the symbols and recognized their systematic nature. These looked like the kind of references a surveyor would make. Sarah Jane has been documenting the underground geography. The search party followed the navigation markers deeper into the cave system, discovering evidence of human presence that became increasingly obvious as they progressed. Food remnants, carefully constructed fire sites, and equipment modifications all indicated that someone with considerable survival skills had been living in the underground environment for an extended period. Most encouraging was the discovery of horse manure that confirmed Sage's presence in the underground system. The paint mare's survival meant that Sarah Jane had retained her most valuable companion and resource for long-term desert survival. The moment of actual contact between the search party and Sarah Jane came with the sudden drama that characterized all significant encounters in wilderness environments. Greyhawk rounded a bend in the cave passage and found himself facing a young woman who looked like a desert spirit, more than the ranch girl they had been seeking for over 2 weeks. Sarah Jane had been changed by her underground residence in ways that went beyond simple physical adaptation to cave living. Her clothing was modified with materials scavenged from the cave environment. Her hair was braided with practical efficiency rather than feminine style, and her eyes held the steady confidence of someone who had mastered an environment that would challenge most experienced outdoorsmen. But the most striking change was psychological. Sarah Jane showed no surprise at the search party's appearance, no overwhelming relief at being rescued. Instead, she studied the newcomers with the careful assessment of someone evaluating whether their presence represented an opportunity or a threat to her established survival situation. "Greyhawk," she said simply, recognizing his reputation, even though they had never met. "I wondered when someone with your skills would find this place." Greyhawk nodded respectfully. "Sarah Jane McKenna, your family is worried about you." Sarah Jane gestured toward the underground river that flowed past their location. "As you can see, I have found what I came to find. The question now is whether this discovery can solve the problems that sent me into Devil's Canyon in the first place." The conversation that followed revealed that Sarah Jane's weeks in the underground system had not been simply a matter of survival endurance. She had conducted the geological survey that had motivated her original expedition, documenting water resources that could transform her family's ranch operations and potentially provide relief for the entire drought-stricken territory. But she had also discovered that accessing these resources would require engineering and logistical operations far beyond what any individual or single family could accomplish. The underground river system was vast and accessible, but developing it for large-scale use would require territorial-level planning and substantial financial investment. "I can lead you out of here," Greyhawk offered. "Your family needs to know you are safe." Sarah Jane looked around the underground chamber that had become her home, then at Sage, who stood quietly nearby, perfectly adapted to cave living. "I'll come out," she said finally. "But not because I need rescue, because it's time to show people what I've found and start the work of making it useful." The girl who had entered Devil's Canyon as an explorer was emerging as something much more significant. A person who had discovered resources that could change the future of Arizona territory, and who possessed the knowledge and determination necessary to make that change happen. The journey from Devil's Canyon's underground depths back to the surface world took 2 full days, not because of technical difficulties, but because Sarah Jane insisted on documenting every aspect of the route for future development operations. She moved through the cave systems with the confidence of someone returning home, pointing out water flow patterns, structural features, and access points that would be crucial for engineering the large-scale water extraction her discovery made possible. When the search party finally emerged into desert sunlight on October 24th, Sarah Jane McKenna was no longer the missing ranch girl who had prompted a territorial-wide rescue effort. She had become the discoverer of Arizona Territory's most significant water resource, and her knowledge would reshape the region's future development for generations. The reunion with her family at the McKenna Ranch was emotional but complicated by the magnitude of what Sarah Jane had accomplished during her 3 weeks in Devil's Canyon. Patrick McKenna's relief at his daughter's safe return was tempered by his growing understanding that her discoveries would attract attention and opportunities that could transform their quiet ranching operation into something far more complex and significant. Bridget McKenna held her daughter close while mentally cataloging the physical and psychological changes that 3 weeks of underground living had created. Sarah Jane was leaner, stronger, and carried herself with a confidence that seemed to radiate from some inner certainty about her place in the world. She had left home as a girl and returned as someone who had proven herself capable of surviving and thriving in conditions that would challenge experienced frontiersmen. Michael and James McKenna struggled to reconcile their image of their adventurous little sister with the composed young woman who described complex engineering challenges and territorial development opportunities with the expertise of a professional geologist. Mary Catherine McKenna was simply grateful to see Sage return safely, though she recognized that both horse and rider had been fundamentally changed by their underground experience. News of Sarah Jane's discovery spread throughout Arizona Territory, with the speed that only extraordinary events could generate in frontier communities. The underground river system she had mapped represented the largest known water resource in the Sonoran Desert region, with potential flow capacity that could support agricultural development, mining operations, and urban growth that had previously been impossible in the drought-prone territory. Territorial Governor Frederick Treatle requested a personal meeting with Sarah Jane within a week of her emergence from Devil's Canyon. The governor's interest was both official and personal. His administration desperately needed success stories that would attract federal investment and encourage statehood consideration, while his private business interests included mining operations that could benefit enormously from reliable water access. But Sarah Jane's approach to her discovery was more sophisticated than territorial officials had anticipated. Her 3 weeks of survival in Devil's Canyon had provided her with time to think carefully about the implications of her find, and she had developed clear ideas about how the water resources should be developed and who should benefit from their exploitation. The underground river belongs to Arizona Territory and its people, Sarah Jane told Governor Treatle during their meeting in Prescott. It should be developed in ways that benefit local communities and families who have built their lives here, not outside investors who see only profit opportunities. Sarah Jane's position created both opportunities and challenges for territorial development planning. Her knowledge was essential for any successful development of the water resources, but her insistence on local control complicated the large-scale investment strategies that territorial officials favored for rapid economic growth. The most significant long-term relationship that emerged from Sarah Jane's rescue was her ongoing collaboration with Grey Hawk, whose tracking skills had made her discovery's development possible. Grey Hawk understood that Sarah Jane's knowledge of underground geography, combined with his expertise in territorial navigation and cross-cultural communication, created opportunities for resource development that respected both white settler needs and Native American territorial rights. Grey Hawk's mixed heritage and established relationships with Apache, Crow, and Mexican communities made him an invaluable partner for development projects that required cooperation across cultural boundaries. His trading post became the unofficial headquarters for planning the complex logistics of underground water access, equipment transport, and workforce coordination that Sarah Jane's discovery demanded. Together, Sarah Jane and Greyhawk developed an approach to water resource development that was unprecedented in territorial history. Rather than pursuing rapid exploitation for maximum profit, they designed sustainable extraction systems that would provide long-term benefits while preserving the underground river system's ecological integrity. Their partnership also created new opportunities for cultural exchange and understanding between territorial communities that had often been in conflict. Apache knowledge of underground geography complemented Sarah Jane's geological observations, while Mexican engineering techniques proved essential for developing access systems that could operate reliably in desert conditions. Within 2 years of Sarah Jane's emergence from the underground river system, Devil's Canyon had been transformed from a feared and avoided wilderness into one of Arizona Territory's most important economic resources. The engineering projects required to access the underground water created employment opportunities for hundreds of workers from diverse backgrounds, while the reliable water supply enabled agricultural and mining development throughout the region. But the most significant transformation was cultural rather than economic. Sarah Jane's survival story and her approach to resource development created new models for territorial growth that emphasized cooperation, sustainability, and respect for the land's natural characteristics rather than simple exploitation and extraction. The cave systems where Sarah Jane had lived for 3 weeks became tourist destinations that attracted visitors from throughout the American Southwest. Her underground homestead was preserved as a monument to frontier resourcefulness and scientific exploration, inspiring other young women to pursue careers in geology, engineering, and territorial development. By 1890, 5 years after her disappearance, into Devil's Canyon, Sarah Jane McKenna had become one of Arizona Territory's most influential citizens. Her water development company operated in partnership with Greyhawk and supported by her family's ranch operations had established sustainable water supplies for over 30 communities throughout the Sonoran Desert region. More importantly, her survival story had become a territorial legend that inspired generations of young people to approach the harsh desert environment with respect, scientific curiosity, and confidence in their ability to find solutions to seemingly impossible challenges. Schools throughout the territory included Sarah Jane's experience in their curricula as an example of how careful preparation, systematic thinking, and determination could overcome even the most daunting obstacles. The underground river that Sarah Jane discovered continued to flow reliably through drought years and abundant seasons alike, providing the foundation for Arizona Territory's transition to statehood and its development into a modern southwestern state. The engineering systems she designed with Greyhawk's assistance became models for sustainable water development throughout the American West. Sarah Jane McKenna, who had entered Devil's Canyon as a 16-year-old ranch girl seeking water for her family's drought-stricken operation, emerged as a pioneer whose discoveries and survival skills helped shape the future of an entire region. Her story proved that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the simplest needs, and that courage combined with scientific knowledge could transform apparent disasters into discoveries that benefit countless future generations. The tracks that Greyhawk had followed through windblown sand had led not just to a missing girl, but to the underground rivers that would sustain the American Southwest for generations to come. And in the end, that was perhaps the most extraordinary part of Sarah Jane McKenna's extraordinary story. that her individual survival had revealed resources that would ensure the survival and prosperity of entire communities for decades into the future. Devil's Canyon, once feared as a place where travelers vanished without trace, became known as the place where a young woman's courage and intelligence had discovered the keys to the desert's hidden abundance. And Grey Hawk, the half-crow scout who could read stories in windblown sand, had tracked not just a missing person, but the future of Arizona Territory itself. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.